The corridor smelled like recycled air and old blood, and Sergeant Mara Voss was already dead when she stepped onto the transport platform. She just didn't know it yet. She was running. Everyone was running, because the Arvith had cracked the Callisto station hull, plating on Deck 7, and the evacuation alarms had been screaming for 11 minutes, and the math on 11 minutes was not good. Mara shoved past a contractor in a yellow vest, ducked under a falling ceiling panel, and reached the platform at the same moment as a man she did not recognize. Tall civilian clothes, carrying someone over his shoulder. An old woman, dead weight. His face was slick with effort, and his collar was torn where someone had grabbed him. He looked at Mara. She looked at him. Threshold light was red. Overloaded. One more person and the whole teleport matrix would misfire, scatter everyone aboard into something that wasn't quite atoms and wasn't quite people. The man, she found out later his name was Darren Polks, logistics coordinator. No military training, absolutely no reason to be on this platform at all. Looked at the threshold light, at the old woman on his shoulder, and stepped on anyway. Mara stepped on because she wasn't the kind of person who let civilians die alone. The light turned white, then nothing, then everything. She came back to herself on a floor she didn't recognize, under light that was too clean and too still. Ceiling maybe 4 meters up, walls the color of old bone. The air tasted like nothing at all, which was more unsettling than any smell would have been. Polks was beside her, still holding the old woman, who was breathing. That was the first surprise. The old woman was breathing. Polks himself was breathing. Mara checked her own hands, both there, fingers persistent, and pushed herself upright. She'd been hit before. 2 tours of active deployment meant she'd been hit by things, with mass and velocity and hostile intent. The experience of being hit left a signature in the body, a kind of retroactive record, a catalog of impact that you discovered by moving and finding what moved wrong. She moved now and discovered nothing. No pain, no impairment, no sense of recent damage. Her ribs were intact. Her skull was intact. She ran through the inventory quickly and without sentimentality, the way you check equipment before a mission, and found all items present and accounted for. The transport platform had destroyed her. She was certain of that. She'd felt it. The white compression of an overloaded matrix. The specific wrongness of physics behaving incorrectly. And she remembered thinking, in the fractional instant before thought became impossible, that she had done the right thing, and it was a shame about the timing. Now she was in a room with walls the color of old bone, holding all her original parts. And the timing appeared to be more flexible than she'd assumed. There were others in the room, a teenager with a bloody sleeve who kept saying something under his breath in a language Mara couldn't place, his hands moving with the restless precision of someone who solved problems with his hands, and could not find the problem to grab onto. A woman in a medical uniform sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, back straight even so, her eyes cataloging the room with the systematic attention of someone who had been trained to assess damage, and was currently performing that assessment on a situation rather than a body. An older man with a naval insignia on his jacket who was standing very still the way men stand when they are trying not to show that they are afraid, which is a specific quality of stillness that Mara recognized because she had practiced it herself. A boy of maybe 16, with his back against the wall, and his eyes opened so wide that Mara could see white around the iris. Not with the blankness of shock, but with the particular hyper-alertness of someone who had decided that, if they looked at everything hard enough, something would make sense. She looked at all of them. She looked at herself, her suit, her hands, the state of her equipment, most of which was either missing or present in forms she hadn't expected. She looked at the room itself. She was a woman who had survived 8 years of service by understanding the situation before acting on it. And the situation, as best she could reconstruct it, was this. She was dead. She was in a room with other dead people, and someone or something had collected them. The collecting implied purpose. The purpose was the important thing. Until she understood the purpose, she could not evaluate the options. She sat with this for the 8 seconds it took to perform all necessary observations. And then she stood up, which was the only available action, and which she therefore performed without hesitation. And in the center of the room, a sphere. It was black and it was enormous, easily 3 meters across, and it sat on the floor with the absolute self-assurance of something that had never needed to explain itself to anyone. Mara had seen a lot of things in her 8 years of service. She had been in a firefight on Titan's outer ring. She had watched a ship come apart at the seams from an Arveth particle lance and had calculated, correctly, that she was far enough from the debris field to survive. She had a scar on her left forearm from a piece of shrapnel she'd removed herself with a field kit and a great deal of profanity. The sphere unmade her completely. It opened. Not a hatch, not a seam. It simply became open, the way a thought becomes an idea. A change in state rather than a mechanical event. And from the interior came a voice that was not quite a voice, more like the concept of a voice, resonating through the floor and the walls and the bones of Mara's inner ear. "Your lives have ended," it said. "What you do with them now belongs to me." The teenager said something sharp in his language, and the naval officer said quietly, "Steady." The sphere extruded a display, or something that functioned like a display, a flat plane of light hanging in the air at reading height, and on the display was an image. A creature, bipedal but wrong, portions off, in ways that the human eye registered as deeply functionally incorrect. Too many joints. A head that suggested a face without committing to one. Around it, a second image, a city block. Coordinates underneath, rendered in numerals that were almost recognizable. "Mission parameters," said the sphere. "Target entity. Elimination required. Time allocation. 90 minutes. Mara looked at the naval officer. He looked at her. His name tag said Reeves. "Is anyone else?" she said carefully, very certain that they were just on a transport platform. "I was in my office," said the medical officer, "filing incident reports. I was trying not to die," said Polks. He'd set the old woman down against the wall. She was awake now, blinking slowly, apparently uninterested in the specifics of her situation. The boy with the wide eyes pressed himself further into the wall. "We're dead," he said. "They told me, the people before us. They said everyone here is dead." "I'm not dead," said the teenager with the bloody sleeve. He said it with the particular conviction of someone who was mostly sure. "The platform," Mara said. "It was coming together now, slow and cold, ice forming. The platform misfired. We all died on the platform, and now—" She looked at the sphere. "Something caught us. Something is using us," said Reeves. "From the sphere, with the cultum of a system reporting weather data, equipment is available. Suits and weapons are in the containers along the east wall. Deployment will occur in 8 minutes, whether or not equipment is retrieved." The containers were there. They had always been there, Mara realized. She'd registered them as furniture when she'd first looked at the room, the way you register furniture, and she felt a cold shame at having been so easily managed. She crossed to them and opened the nearest one. The suit was black. It looked like nothing. A second skin, close-fitting, no seams she could find, no fastening mechanism she could identify. She turned it over in her hands, and it turned with her, orientating itself. And when she held it up to the light, she could see that the material was moving slightly, a slow molecular restlessness like something alive and waiting. She put it on. It was the worst and best moment of her life. The suit closed around her like a decision being made, and for 3 seconds she felt nothing, and then she felt everything. Her heartbeat counted out in stereo, her blood pressure noted and adjusted. The micro-tear in her left knee from a training injury 2 years ago, registered and cataloged and gently, persistently supported. She felt the particular alertness of something that was not quite an amplifier, and not quite a partner. It was simply the best possible version of her body, handed back to her, with the implicit understanding that she would spend it. 8 of them, said Reeves, looking at the display. He'd suited up without comment, with the efficiency of a man who had decided the specifics of the situation, less important than the specifics of what to do next. One primary target. Could be more. The display doesn't show more, Mara said. Displays lie. Or they show you what they want you to chase. He picked up one of the weapons, a pistol configuration thing that felt like it was, made of light and bad intentions, and checked it the way you check any weapon. Magazine, action, safety, weight. Where I'm from, we call that a flanking operation. Where I'm from, Mara said, we call that Tuesday. They deployed in pieces, which was not ideal, and which the sphere seemed genuinely uninterested in resolving. One moment Mara was in the room, and the next she was on a street she had never seen, under a sky the color of a bruise, in a city she recognized only as human. The horizontal geometry of it, the layered smell of 10,000 individual lives compressed into concrete. And, exhaust, the specific acoustic fingerprint of a place where people had been arguing and laughing and sleeping on top of each other for so long, the buildings themselves had absorbed it. Someone nearby had been cooking fish. 30 meters overhead, a child's kite was caught in the cables between buildings, one tattered red triangle, unrecoverable. These were the details that the mind cataloged automatically in moments of extremity, not because they were tactically relevant, but because the mind was built for this world and could not stop being interested in it, even when the world had officially ended. The street was empty. That was wrong. Streets this size were never empty. 20 meters ahead of her, standing in the center of the road, with the casual posture of something that had nowhere to be and nothing to fear, was the creature from the display. It was wearing a human shape. That was the first thing she understood. The proportions were close. Close enough to fool a camera, maybe. Close enough to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully. But Mara had been trained to look carefully, and she could see the way the head sat on the neck with a half degree of wrongness. Could see the hands, which were almost hands, but not quite. Fingers one joint too long, knuckles in configurations that suggested a completely different evolutionary path toward the concept of gripping things. It was carrying a bag of groceries. The groceries were real. She could smell them from here. Something vegetable, something sweet. The creature had been shopping. It turned and looked at her. Not in the way that people look at people. In the way that something looks at a stimulus it hasn't yet categorized. Mara did not move. She had been in enough dangerous situations to know that the worst thing you could do when a predator was deciding what you were was to help it decide. For a moment, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, the longest 4 seconds of her newly resumed life, they simply stood there. The alien with its groceries. Mara in her black suit with her improbable weapon. The empty street between them like a question neither of them had asked. Then Reeves materialized 6 feet behind the creature and exhaled sharply, and the creature turned its head 140 degrees on that wrong neck, and something in its categorization process reached a conclusion. What followed was not what any tactical manual would call a clean engagement. The alien shed its human shape the way you shed a coat, and without apparent effort, and what emerged was not the creature from the display, but something larger and worse. Not a monster, exactly, because monsters have a coherent design philosophy, but something that had been built for an environment where humans had no expectations to violate. It moved in directions that the geometry of the street didn't quite accommodate, and it was fast. And the first thing it did was put Reeves through a parked vehicle with the flat of one of its upper limbs. Mara fired. The weapon made a sound like silence, happening very quickly, and a portion of the alien's outer structure vaporized. It did not stop moving. The others materialized around the edges of the situation. Polks appearing behind a news kiosk and immediately pressing himself against it. The medical officer, her name was Sarah, Mara learned later, appearing in the middle of the street and going absolutely still with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a survival strategy. The teenager landing in a dead run and accelerating without pause, as if he'd been deployed mid-stride, which perhaps he had. The teenager was the first surprise. His name was Jin, and he had died, as it turned out, in a subway maintenance corridor, where he had been trying to fix a signal relay that wasn't his job to fix because the person whose job it was hadn't shown up. He had no military training, no tactical background, no experience with anything resembling this situation. What he had was a quality that Mara had no precise word for, a kind of aggressive optimism, a refusal to consult the odds, fundamental conviction that the problem in front of him was a problem he could solve if he just got close enough to it. He got very close to it. The alien had a weak point. All things have weak points. And Jin found it the way you find a loose thread in a sweater, pulling on things until something gave. He went in low, under the sweep of the creature's upper limb, and grabbed one of its secondary joints with both hands and wrenched, and the alien made a sound like a ship under pressure, high and metallic and wrong and staggered. It was a genuinely human thing to do, in a situation that had no business being approached as though it were human. Mara shot it again. This time it stayed down. "The display said one," said Reeves, who had extracted himself from the vehicle and was standing with his weapon up and his nose bleeding freely. The display was incorrect. From 3 streets over, the sound of something large moving. They found the rest of the alien's family in a residential building that had, by the evidence of the mailboxes and the children's shoes, stacked by the door, been occupied by people up until very recently. The building was not occupied by people anymore. The alien had nested here, or found, both comprehensible. Everything alive finds a place to be safe, a place to come back to, place where the outside can't reach. And unbearable. Because the thing about the shoes was that they were small and they were paired, and someone put them there with the automatic tidiness of a household that expected itself to continue. She did not look at them again. She looked at the stairwell. There were 6 more of the aliens. They were spread through 3 floors in a configuration that suggested either tactical deployment or domestic arrangement. Mara was not certain the distinction was meaningful. 2 were in what had been a kitchen. 1 was in a corridor, motionless until they came within 6 meters of it, at which point it became very motional very quickly. The others were above, in rooms she could hear but not see, which was the worst configuration for an enclosed engagement, because sound told you there was something there, gave you no information about angle. There was also something that appeared to be the family's eldest, larger than the others and slower, in a way that did not mean what slow usually meant, because the eldest was thinking, and the others had simply been reacting. It hung back while the others attacked. It watched the team move. It tracked Sarah, specifically, with the focused attention of something that had identified the logistics of the group. The person who kept the others functional, and was calculating accordingly. It was learning. Mara registered this and updated her threat assessment and kept it at the top. Mind the way you keep a debt you owe. Present, constant, not panicked about, but never forgotten. Shot one of the secondary aliens with the expression of a man surprised to find himself doing it. Not surprised by the action he'd performed without hesitation, but by the ease of it, the way the suit had reduced the gap between intention and execution to something approaching thought. He shot a second one with the expression of a man who had processed the surprise and filed it. Sarah patched up Reeves's broken fingers while simultaneously giving him firing instructions that he followed without comment. Her voice level and precise in the way that emergency medicine required levelness and precision, because panic was a luxury and she was not in the business of luxuries. Jin got bitten on the shoulder by one of the smaller creatures. Hatchlings, they called them later, though that word didn't capture the specific horror of something that came up to your knee and had 17 teeth and moved. Conviction of something that had never learned to be afraid of things larger than itself. And kept fighting anyway, hissing through the pain with the particular stubbornness of someone who had committed to this course of action and wasn't prepared to renegotiate. He kept fighting with the hatchling attached to his shoulder. He kept fighting after it let go. He kept fighting after the letting go hurt more than the biting had. The eldest struck when Mara was reloading. It came from above. It had been on the ceiling, which was something she filed away for future reference, and it took her off her feet and had her 4 meters in the air before she understood what was happening. The suit screamed warnings across her perception in sensations rather than words. Is your heart rate? Here is your altitude. Here is the fact that something very strong has your arms pinned and is carrying you up. She stopped fighting it. That was the counterintuitive thing, the thing that took the fractional second of clarity that the suit's stimulants fighted. She stopped fighting, went still, let the alien interpret stillness as compliance, and in the half-second, when its grip shifted to accommodate her apparent surrender, she drove her elbow into the joint Jin, had already partially damaged and felt something give. The alien dropped her. She fell 4 meters. The suit handled it. She felt the impact the way you feel a firm mattress, present, accounted for, survivable. The eldest hit the ground a moment later. It did not have a suit. They regrouped in the street in the silence that followed. The city was still empty. Somewhere distant, a piece of damaged infrastructure was making a rhythmic complaint. "Timer says 11 minutes left," said Reeves. He was holding his broken fingers with his other hand. Not dramatically, just the way you hold something that hurts. "Display updated. Shows a secondary target, 2 blocks east." "How many of us are at full capability?" Mara asked. "Define full," said Polks. "Capable of doing the thing that needs doing." "Then yes, all of us." They found the secondary target in a park. It was sitting on a bench. It was old. Ancient, possibly, the scale of alien aging being entirely outside Mara's experience. And it was watching the sky the way that very old creatures watch things, with the patience of something that has seen enough versions of a situation to understand that the specific iteration doesn't change the essential nature. It knew they were there. It had probably known for some time. It looked at Mara. She stopped walking. The others stopped behind her. "You're not going to fight," she said. It wasn't a question. The ancient alien looked at her the way it had been looking at the sky, with the patience of something that understood the ending and was at peace with the shape of it. Mara stood there for a long time. The timer ticked. The sky above the city was still that bruised color, either evening or the aftermath of something she didn't want to think about. "I don't know what we are to you," she said. The others didn't stop her. "I don't know what you did to end up here, in this city, in this situation. I don't know if this is a game or a war or something that doesn't have a word in any language we share." She paused. "I know what it looks like when something is not going to run." She lowered her weapon. Jin started to say something. She held up her hand and he stopped. "We have 11 minutes," she said to the ancient alien. "We have orders. We have a system none of us agreed to that will do something unpleasant to us if we don't comply." She looked at the display on the weapon. Countdown. A target indicator pointing directly at the bench. "Tell me why I should." The alien said something. Not in a language. In a sound, a series of sounds, low and resonant, that did something to the air pressure when they were produced, that Mara felt in her sinuses and the back of her throat. It sounded like the closing of something that had been open for a long time. Then it reached into the pocket of its jacket. It was wearing a jacket. Mara's brain refused to fully process, and placed something on the bench beside it. A small object, disc-shaped, made of a material that was not metal and not plastic and caught the dying light like neither. It looked at her once more. Then it was still. She stood over it for a long time. The timer ran out. Nothing happened. Either the sphere didn't care about the secondary target specifically, or it had decided that the primary objective was sufficient, and Mara preferred this interpretation without being certain it was accurate. Something in the encounter had satisfied a condition she hadn't been given the language to understand. They returned to the room. The sphere was silent. The display showed their point tallies in numeral configurations that Mara had never learned but which were immediately legible in the way that anything becomes legible when it is about your own value made numerical. She had the most points, the result of time in service, presumably, or the result of whatever the sphere used as its rubric for a life well spent in violent endeavor. She didn't touch the disk object until they were back in the room, and she had confirmed that everyone was accounted for. Then she looked at it in the clean, bad light of the sphere's glow. It had a surface. The surface had something on it. She turned it at angles until the light cooperated. A map, or something that functioned like a map, not of the city, of something much larger. Stars, possibly. Points of reference arranged in patterns that suggested navigation rather than decoration. And in the center, a mark. Not a city. Not a coordinate. A shape that was somewhere between a question and an answer, like a notation left for someone specific. Not a message for Mara Voss, but a message for whoever was standing where Mara was standing and willing to put a weapon down. She pocketed it. Nobody asked her to explain. Over the next 6 weeks as counted by the return cycles to the sphere's room, operated on a schedule that did not correspond to any calendar Mara had access to. They lost people. Reeves took a hit on the third mission that would have killed him without the suit and that left him with a limp on the fourth. He did not mention the limp. He adapted his footwork instead, quietly and without announcement, the way competent people adapt to new parameters. Mara noted it in her notebook under the heading of things she was not going to comment on unless asked. The boy with the wide eyes, whose name was Tomas, made it through 4 missions. And then one morning the sphere's display showed his name in a different notation, and he was simply not in the room anymore. Nobody explained what that meant. The sphere did not offer explanations. The old woman, her name was Henna, she was 63. She had been on Callisto Station, overseeing a hydrological survey, lasted 2 missions before the sphere's notation changed for her as well. And Mara chose to interpret the notation as retirement rather than something worse, because the interpretation made no material difference, and one of them felt less like a failure. New people arrived. They always arrived confused and frightened and certain they were dead, which they were, which was a fact that never became easy to deliver. Mara delivered it anyway, because someone had to, and because she had decided in the first days that, in the absence of choice about whether to play the game, there was still a choice about how to play it. The sphere had taken their deaths. It had not taken their capability for judgment. She kept the team alive by being difficult. This was, she had found, the most useful human quality in a situation designed around the assumption that dead people would be desperate and manageable. She was relentlessly difficult to manage. She asked questions the sphere didn't answer. She documented mission parameters in a notebook she'd found in the sphere's anteroom. As if the sphere were a client, she was billing for her time, noting anomalies, noting discrepancies between displayed targets and actual threat levels, noting the pattern she'd identified by Mission 9, that the sphere's displays were not lying. Exactly. But they were simplifying. And the gap between simplified and complete was where people got hurt. She declined, twice, to engage targets she had determined were not threats, accepted the sphere's point penalty with the equanimity of someone who had decided that complying with everything was a worse outcome than complying with most things. Jin had become something by this point that she hadn't anticipated, which was the closest thing to optimistic that their situation permitted. He catalogued the aliens. He kept notes in his own way. Not written but memorized. A running archive in his head of every creature they'd encountered, organized by behavior and exploitable weakness rather than by appearance. He was terrible at following tactical instructions and extraordinary at improvising when tactical instructions became irrelevant. It happened more often than anyone with a tactical background would have preferred. Sarah, for her part, ceased to seem as though she was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. She had expanded into the full available space of her professional competence, which was considerable, and had developed a sideline in interpreting the sphere's medical notation that had saved 3 lives already. Pokes said very little and did a great deal, which Mara recognized as a specific species of strength. On the 14th mission, Pokes reached 100 points. He'd been adding them up quietly, without mentioning it, the same undemonstrative competence he'd brought to the first platform decision, the one where he'd stepped on, with the old woman, because she needed to get off Callisto Station, more than he needed to calculate his survival odds. He stood in front of the sphere's display and looked at the 3 options it offered: freedom, return, memory wiped, a weapon upgrade, personal, targeted, better odds next time. Resurrection, 1 person, stored in the sphere's memory, returned whole. Mara watched him from across the room. She knew what she would have chosen, probably. She thought she understood what he was going to choose. What she did not expect was the length of time he stood there, the full weight of the decision apparent in the set of his shoulders. Not hesitation, thoroughness. The way an engineer checks a calculation, not because he doubts the answer, but because the answer matters enough to check. He chose resurrection. He said the name of the boy Tomas, and the sphere opened, and from somewhere inside its impossible dark interior, a boy with wide eyes appeared on the floor, gasping, intact, 23 days younger than the moment he'd stopped being in the room. Tomas looked at Polks. Looked at Tomas. "You're all right," Polk said. Not a question. Tomas looked at his hands. "I don't remember. After the mission. I don't remember. You don't need to." Mara filed this moment next to the moment on the subway platform. She was building a collection of moments that she was not sure what to do with, but that she refused to let go of. Moments when humans behaved like humans in situations designed specifically to make that impossible. They were small moments, most of them. A broken-fingered naval officer giving firing instructions while being patched up. A boy getting bitten on the shoulder and keeping moving. A logistics coordinator choosing resurrection over freedom with the quiet certainty of someone who had made his real choice weeks ago on a platform with a red threshold light. And this was just the same choice in a different form. The sphere had their deaths. It had not taken this. On the 21st mission, Mara found the disk object relevant. The target was not a creature and not a soldier. It was a structure. A relay point, the display indicated in the sphere's own notation, which Mara had by now developed a partial working ability to read, not because the sphere had taught her, but because she had sat in front of its displays for cumulative hours, and her brain had done what human brains do when they encounter patterns. The relay was alien and large and humming, with something that was not quite electricity and not quite data, and was probably both. The display indicated that eliminating it would earn a significant points allocation. The disk map showed the relay as the center mark. She stood in front of the structure for a long time. It was evening in whatever city this was. Not her city, not any city she recognized. And the relay caught the sunset and threw it back in frequencies that the human eye processed as blue and purple and specific orange-white of old stars. It was the most beautiful piece of alien construction she had ever seen. It was also, clearly, operational, connected to something, carrying something, somewhere at frequencies she did not have instruments to measure. She thought about the ancient alien on the bench, the sounds it had made when it spoke, the resonance that she'd felt in her throat. She thought about the map, which had been put down for someone willing to put a weapon down first. "This isn't a target," she said. "The display says it is," said Jin beside her. He was 18 now, or had been 18 when he died, which was the version of him the sphere had on file. And the past 21 missions had done things to the way he held himself, a new economy of motion, a new calibration of when to accelerate and when to wait. He was looking at the relay the way Mara was looking at it, with the specific attention of someone who had been trained to see threats and was currently seeing something else. "The display shows us a picture and calls it a threat," Mara said. "That's not the same as it being one. If we don't get the points, we don't get the points." She held up the disk object. "I think this is a signal relay. I think the thing it's relaying is a signal, specifically to the spheres. I think something is trying to talk to whatever built them." "Something," said Jin. "The aliens." She thought about it. "Or the humans. We don't actually know who built the spheres. We've assumed they're alien because they're incomprehensible. But the sphere's own Zeta says they were manufactured. It says it in its third-level notation, which I admit took me 16 missions to work out, but it says it. Manufactured origin, terrestrial classification." The silence was significant. "Humans built them," said Jin slowly. "Someone human built them. Or built the template. The design got transmitted from somewhere else, and someone human ran the factory." She looked at the relay, its impossible steady light. "Someone is communicating about that. Someone has been trying to communicate about that for a long time. And whatever is on the other end of this relay is not the thing we've been hunting." She placed the disk object against the relay's base. It did not fit, exactly. It was not the right shape. But it sat against the surface with the particular ease of something that belonged in proximity to this object, and had simply been waiting for the proximity. The relay changed. She felt it more than saw it. Shift in the frequency of the hum, a deepening, a broadening. The sky above the city responded in a way that skies don't usually respond to things, happening at ground level. Not light, not sound, a quality of attention. A very large thing slowly becoming aware of a very small thing, and finding the small thing interesting. "That might have been a mistake," said Jin. "It might," Mara agreed. She did not move. What came from the sky was not an attack. It was not a rescue. It was something that she spent the rest of her life trying to find the right word for, and never quite managed, because it was the kind of thing that required a new word. And she was not ultimately a person given to inventing new words. It was a transmission. It was a question being answered. It was the specific feeling of a door being opened by someone on the other side who had been waiting a long time. Someone to knock from this side. Information came. Not data, she had no equipment to receive data, but understanding. The way understanding sometimes arrives not through learning, but through a sudden rearrangement of what you already knew. She understood what the sphere was. She understood what the game was. Not a game, a sorting mechanism, a tool for identifying which dead were worth keeping, which dead had in them what was needed for what came next. She understood what came next. It was large and complex and involved things she had no vocabulary for, and which required, according to whatever vast and patient intelligence had been broadcasting from the other end of this relay for longer than she had been alive, humans who were still capable of being difficult. She could not have described the encounter to anyone afterward in terms that would satisfy a debrief. She tried once with Reeves, who listened carefully and then said, "Oh, so we passed. Something like that. And the aliens we've been killing. The ones who weren't threats were testing to see if we'd notice. The ones who were threats were threats." She thought about the ones who had hurt her team. Not everything that's different from us is a message. Some things are just dangerous. And the sphere is still the sphere, still has a 100-point threshold, still runs the missions. But now we know who built it. Now we know who built it. She looked at her hands. The suit had long since been removed. She only wore it in the field now, but she could still feel the memory of it, the sense of her own body at its best. Doesn't change what we do today. No, said Reeves. It changes why we do it. The disk object came back to her the following morning through means she could not explain and stopped trying to. It was simply on the floor beside her when she woke, as if it had always been there, and had merely been taking a brief trip. On its surface the map remained, but the center mark had changed. It was no longer a question, it was a coordinate, a precise, navigable coordinate. And beside it, in notation she could now read, a word, or the nearest alien construction equivalent of a word, a designation, Relay Station 7, access granted. Humanity classification cooperative. She showed it to Polks, who read it with the expression of a man who has done a calculation correctly, and finds the correctness neither surprising nor entirely satisfying, because correctness was always the goal and reaching it is just the thing that lets you start on the next problem. Access to what? He asked. I don't know yet, but we get to find out. We get to find out. She pocketed the disk. After the morning mission. The sphere gave us a morning mission? The sphere always gives us a morning mission. Right. He picked up his weapon with the routine ease of someone who had made a decision about this on a platform a long time ago and was simply following through to its conclusion. Let's go then. The mission was straightforward. 3 contacts, 1 target, 68 minutes on the clock. They finished in 42. Jin took a hit to the ribs that the suit absorbed and that left him swearing colorfully in 3 languages, including one he had apparently learned specifically for situations requiring profanity. Sarah set a small personal record for fastest incapacitation of a secondary target that she mentioned with no particular vanity and that Mara logged in her notebook under the heading of things that were true and should be documented. Reeves moved across the engagement zone with his adapted footwork and the efficiency of someone who had stopped mourning what the old version of his knee could do and had become entirely invested in what the new version could. Tomas, who had died and come back, and who spent the morning missions at the edge of the engagement field, doing things with his hands that looked like prayer, and might have been something he'd learned before he died, finished the mission with 14 points and a notch on the grip of his weapon that he there himself, for reasons he didn't explain and nobody asked about. Mara looked at the notch once and did not look at it again. Some things people did to make the situation survivable were not things that required commentary. The important thing was the surviving. On the way back to the sphere, Mara counted them, 6. All 6 still standing, all 6 making their way through a city that didn't belong to them, in suits that had been given to them by something that had taken their deaths and decided they were worth more alive. She thought about the threshold light going red. She thought about Polks stepping on anyway. She thought about the way that the disk's central mark had changed from a question to a coordinate and about the specific human quality that must have triggered the change. Not strength, not tactical competence, not the ability to survive 21 alien contact missions without being disassembled. Those were table stakes. Squirt. The thing that had shifted the designation from unknown to cooperative was the moment she had lowered a weapon at something that wasn't going to fight. The sphere had been testing for that specifically. What comes next required that specifically. The aliens who had built the relay had been waiting for a species that could be in possession of a weapon and choose not to use it. Not from weakness, not from confusion, but from the deliberate, considered judgment that the target in front of them was not a target. It was, Mara thought, an extremely efficient sorting mechanism. It would kill most things. The things it didn't kill would be exactly the things you wanted at Relay. Station 7 of 7. She did not think they were special. She thought they were representative. The kind of humans you got when you took a random cross-section of the species and asked them to survive in a situation designed to make survival contingent on being difficult and competent and occasionally willing to set down a gun. You got a naval officer who bled without complaint and gave firing instructions simultaneously, who adapted his footwork and kept moving without making a performance of the adaptation. You got a logistics coordinator who chose resurrection. You got a teenager who grabbed an alien with both hands because he couldn't figure out what else to do, and who cataloged every alien they'd encountered in a running mental archive because his brain could not resist understanding things. You got a medical officer who expanded into every millimeter of available professional competence and then found more. You got a quiet boy who notched his weapon and prayed and kept his points. You got, Mara thought, the thing that humans were when you removed the circumstance that allowed them to be something less. The sphere hadn't built this team. The sphere had sorted for it. The team had built itself, incrementally, out of the residue of who they'd each been before the platform and the train, and the survey corridor, and the small daily acts of showing up for things that weren't strictly their responsibility. The sphere had just concentrated them in the same room and said, "Here is a problem. Here are weapons. Here is a time limit." The humans had done everything else. She thought about the relay, its steady light against the evening sky. She thought about the sound the ancient alien had made when it spoke. Not language, something beneath language. The resonance in her throat that felt like being told something she'd known a long time ago and had simply needed reminding of. She thought about the specific design logic of a sorting mechanism that killed most things and kept the ones who could notice that something ancient and exhausted on a bench was not a target. It was, she thought, a very human thing to build. Not efficient, not clean, brutal in fact, and arbitrarily lethal, and designed with complete indifference to the well-being of the things passing through it. Its outcome, if you made it through the mechanism, was exactly the thing you'd want on the other side of a door marked Relay Station 7 of 7. You'd want the people who'd been stripped down to their fundamentals and hadn't stopped being themselves. You'd want the people who were still difficult, after 6 weeks of dying and coming back and being told their lives belonged to someone else. The sphere hummed. The display changed. The coordinate on Mara's disk glowed with the specific urgency of something that had been waiting long enough and had finally been given a reason to stop. She read the new display fully this time, slowly, without rushing the notation she'd worked to understand. It detailed a war. It detailed its scope in units she couldn't convert, but which implied duration measured in generations and geography measured in systems. It detailed what was needed at Relay Station 7 of 7, which was not soldiers in the traditional sense and not diplomats in the traditional sense, but something in between. People who had demonstrated, under conditions designed to make demonstration costly, that they could be trusted to be in the room when the decision was made. People classified cooperative. People who had held a weapon at something exhausted on a bench and chosen deliberately not to use it. People who had, against all available pressure, remained people. She looked at each of them in turn, standing in the sphere's room under the bone-colored light, suited and armed and alive in the specific complicated way that dead people who had decided to continue were alive. Reeves, with his adapted stance and his bleeding, stopped and his absolute unhesitating reliability. Sarah, with the medical kit she'd customized over 6 weeks, until it worked the way she needed it to work. Jin with his archive of alien behavior and his refusal to calculate odds before acting. Pokes with his hands folded and his face quiet with the particular peace of someone who made his choice once and did not revisit them. With the notched weapon and the wide eyes that were now the width of someone who had survived what the wide eyes had been afraid of and had found it survivable. She thought about the threshold light going red. She thought about Polk stepping on anyway. "We go to the relay station," she said. "We find out what the war is. We decide what to do with that information. Anyone want out?" The silence was the answer. Not the silence of people with no remaining options. They'd had choices at every stage, had exercised those choices at cost, had each, at some point, been the person in the room who was not following the rules and had paid the point penalty and had stood there afterwards still, making the same choices. The silence was the silence of people who had already decided, back in the moments that mattered, for whom this moment was just the continuation of a decision made on a platform or a maintenance corridor or a bench in an alien city under a sky that was nobody's home. Jin said it, eventually, with the cheerful indefensibility of his particular brand of reckless optimism, the thing that had gotten him through 6 weeks of impossible situations. By refusing to treat them as impossible, we've been fighting their way for 6 weeks. Be nice to do it ours. The sphere hummed. The display changed. The coordinate on Mara's disk glowed with the specific urgency of something that had been waiting long enough. She pocketed it. She picked up her weapon. She thought briefly about Callisto Station and the platform and the red threshold light and the math that had said one more person was too many, and the fact that the math had been correct and had not mattered. She'd been dead for 6 weeks and she'd never felt more like herself. "Let's go," she said.